Filibuster.
Oh, President, vote. President, vote. Vote. Legislation, vote. President, vote. Legislation. Legislation, filibuster. Legislation, vote. 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 Legislation, vote. Americans, vote. 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 Americans. Americans, vote. Vote. Filibuster, 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 legislation, legislation, filibuster, filibuster, legislation, filibuster, filibuster, legislation, legislation, vote, vote, President. And Americans,
election, Americans, legislation, Americans, filibuster, the vote, vote.
President, Americans, election, Americans, election, President, election, President, Americans, President, Americans, election, Americans, vote, President, filibuster, legislation, filibuster, vote, election, the election, Americans, President, and election, legislation, the election, President, vote, filibuster, legislation,
President, vote, filibuster, election, filibuster, vote, filibuster, President, election, the legislation, that election, Senate election, the election, filibuster, legislation, filibuster, President,
filibuster, vote, Americans, President, Americans, election, Americans, vote, election, vote, and election, Americans, vote, election, legislation, Americans, President, vote, filibuster, vote, filibuster, legislation,
President, election, President, vote, election, President, election, Americans, vote, legislation, vote, President, vote,
legislation, filibuster, the election, legislation, Americans, legislation, filibuster, legislation, President, filibuster, President, filibuster, the filibuster, legislation, vote, the filibuster, vote, the President, filibuster,
President, filibuster, vote, President, election, opponent, election, vote, election, legislation.
President, I have votes, election, vote, filibuster,
vote, Americans, vote, election, legislation, President, election, President, vote, election, legislation, vote, filibuster, vote, President, legislation, election.